So last week we began a series, Rebuild, Renew, Restore. And we began in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 1, as we're introduced to him as he's living in the land of Susa, or at least he is there for a while. And like a person who has perhaps evacuated from a hurricane, he sends word back to his home people, to his homeland in Jerusalem, and asks, how are things? How are things in Jerusalem? And unfortunately, the news that he gets is not good news. So he spends a while grieving this loss, grieving the damage to his city, grieving the damage to his homeland, grieving the hurt that his people are experiencing. And afterward, he turns to God in prayer. And in his prayer, he exhibits hope. Hope, which is part of the foundation of every time we build, every time we rebuild, every time we are renewed, and every time we are restored. For if you think about it, a person would never lay a foundation for a building if they didn't have hopes for its future. And we were reminded about how God has hopes for us, how God has dreams for us, and it's for a good future. And that if we search for God with all of our hearts, we will find God. So this week, as we continue in our series about rebuilding, renewing, and restoring, we're going to see two different stories about that process of rebuilding. We have this story in Joshua that I just read to us, and then the one in Nehemiah that we will be continuing this week. Now, I want us to see something in these stories. I want us to see that while they do not rebuild in the same exact way, they do both rebuild in faithful ways. While they don't rebuild in the exact same way, they rebuild in faithful ways. And they show bravery and strength in doing so. Did you notice in this text that Joshua is encouraged by God not once, not twice, but 3 times to be strong and brave? Many people who are teachers told me that in order to teach students, you often have to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. They taught us something similar in preaching class. So we see here that God is illustrating to Joshua that very thing, to be brave, to be strong. But he tells them how to be brave is to realize that God is with him. Now, Joshua has got a lot on his plate. You see, he had been the helper of Moses, and Moses has just died. The people have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're about to cross into the promised land. But even as they cross into the promised land, it's not like arriving in the Disneyland parking lot where all you have to do is walk a long way and pay a fee and you go in. He still had a ton of work to do in rebuilding his people. And he finds himself in a new role. Now, throughout our lives, we often find ourselves in new roles. It may be a new job. It may be a new role as a parent or an aunt or a big brother or a big sister. We might find ourselves in new roles as we are having to negotiate with insurance companies or do different things. We might find ourselves in new roles as our bodies begin to change, and we find ourselves with the name patient, or perhaps the name caregiver as we care for those in difficult times. We might find ourselves on the unemployment rolls, so to say. Our roles change. And oftentimes when our roles change, we find ourselves afraid, whether we acknowledge it or not. And to this, we hear God saying to Joshua as he embraces a new role, a new place, a new need to rebuild, to be brave, to be strong. And he says, because I am with you. as we return to our Nehemiah story, we're going to see how he is being brave and he is being strong, even as he returns to his people's homeland to rebuild. And Joshua, as he rebuilds, goes to a new place. It's that way in our lives sometimes too. Not only when we physically rebuild, whether we rebuild something that looks similar or is in the same place, or whether we go somewhere new, or perhaps even if we stay in the same physical place, the way that we rebuild our hearts and our minds and our lives can be similar to what it was before, or it can be very different. In either case, we're called to be strong and to be brave. In Nehemiah chapter 2, we discover that it is the month of Nisan. Now, the month before it, the month earlier in the book is Kislev. So some time has passed, and we see that Nehemiah is there, and he's serving as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Now, being a cupbearer was a certain position that required a certain amount of risk, because the cupbearer was the one that had to eat and drink the things that were going to be fed to the king before they were fed to the king. Now, since some people might want to poison the king, there was a certain risk, but there were also certain benefits. I bet Nehemiah had some of the best food and wine there was at that time if he was serving as the king's cupbearer. But he also had the opportunity to get to know the king, to be in relationship with him. And so the king gets to know Nehemiah, and he notices that something is wrong with Nehemiah. In verse 2, the king asked me, "Why do you seem sad? Since you aren't sick, you must have a broken heart." I was afraid. I was very afraid, and replied, "May the king live forever. Why shouldn't I seem sad when the city, the place of my family's graves, is in ruins and its gates destroyed by fire?" As we shared last week, this is a place where we might feel. We might feel that way because of the effects of Ida, but we might feel that way because of the effects of COVID, or might feel that way because of the political unrest or the military situations. We might feel that way because of something more personal. But Nehemiah is there, and his king knows. His friend, dare I say, in some ways, knows that something is wrong. And he speaks of the ruin, not even to himself, but to his family. And the king asks, "What is it you need? What is it that you need?" Now, when someone asks us that question, sometimes we respond immediately. I need X, Y, and Z. Sometimes we might respond, "I'm okay, I don't need anything." Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. I know someone quite well who, when they begin to say, "I'm okay, it's okay, it doesn't matter," that what they're actually saying is the exact opposite. When they begin to say it doesn't matter is when it matters to them the most. And sometimes when we are in a place of need, that's how we want to respond. We want to either shield our reputation and say, "I don't need anything," or perhaps we're trying to shield ourselves from the very fact that we need something. But the king here knows, and he says, "What is it that you need?" And Nehemiah says, "I prayed to the God of heaven and replied." Notice his response to the question, "What do you need?" isn't to decide what it is that he most wants. It's to respond in prayer. I find that pretty remarkable and incredibly faithful that he was able to do this. And then he goes on and he speaks to the king saying, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, please send me to Judah, to the city of my family's graves, so that I may rebuild it." So essentially, he's asking his boss for a little vacation time to go and rebuild. And certainly taking the time to rebuild is one of the important steps of being able to rebuild. And as we continue, it says, "With the queen sitting beside him, the king asked me, 'How long will you be away, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me, and I told him how long I would be gone. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may letters be given me addressed to the governors of the province beyond the river to allow me to travel to Judah. May the king also issue a letter of Asaph to the keeper of the king's forest for the beams of the temple fortress gates, for the city wall, and for the house in which I will live. So first he goes and he asks the king for a little vacation time. Then he asks the king for what would essentially be a passport, for a letter of passage to go through these other territories. And then he asks for the very supplies to help rebuild his land that is far away. Sometimes it is the people nearest us that help us rebuild. Sometimes it is the ones far away. But most of the time, God uses both. The king gave me what I asked, for the gracious power of my God was with me. So I went to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. The king had sent officers of the army and cavalry with me. So he has gotten the things that he needs, and he has set off. He has showed bravery, and he has begun this process of rebuilding by gathering supplies. Have you ever thought about what supplies that you need or that we need to rebuild? A lot of times it's not things as simple as a beam of wood, but something perhaps as the strength and courage of offering forgiveness or of receiving it. Sometimes it is the strength of having courage. Sometimes it is something else, something deeper. So he gathers the things that he needs to rebuild, and then he encounters opposition. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard this, they were very angry that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So Sanballat and Tobiah are basically mad that the Israelites are getting help, and they aren't. People never do that today, do they? People never get jealous of certain people who get help and others who don't. People never feel like they are being favorited or that someone else is getting special treatment or perhaps that they have been forgotten. We see this going all the way back into the ages. And so Sanballat and Tobiah are complaining because Nehemiah has been given the things he needs to rebuild. And what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah keeps going. He continues to have the strength and courage to move forward. When I reached Jerusalem and had been there for 3 days, I set out at night, taking only a few people with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God was prompting me to do for Jerusalem, and the only animal I took with me was the one I rode. I went out by night through the valley gate, past the Dragon's Spring, to the Dung Gate, so that I could inspect the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, as well as its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the Spring Gate and to the King's Pool, since there was no room for the animal on which I was riding to pass. I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. Then I turned back and returned by entering through the valley gate. So we see here in this process of building that Nehemiah has had the courage to ask for help, and he has also had the courage to go and see things as they truly are. To look beyond just the surface, to look beyond that view from a distance and to inspect the walls. Sometimes the greatest damage is not what we see on the surface. This past week, I met with a group of pastors here on the West Bank as we were working to coordinate our response to Hurricane Ida, to be able to help the most people through the resources of the different churches and that which is being sent to us. And one of my colleagues who has a lot more experience in this said something about mold. About how mold on the surface is one thing, because you know it needs to be cleaned. But mold on the inside of the wall, mold on the inside of our hearts, is sometimes the hardest to know is there and causes problems. I think of someone who shared with me after Katrina that they had mold growing inside their walls but didn't know it, and how sick they got. Sometimes it's easy to look and to see the sins or the shortfalls or the needs on the surface and to not even take the time to inspect our hearts, to search our lives for those places that might be the most in need of repair, the most in need of God's rebuilding, restoring, renewing, refreshing, forgiving, strengthening grace. So I pray that we have the courage of Nehemiah to actually inspect, to actually see things as they really are. And as the psalmist says in Psalm 139, you have searched me and know me. Have we ever stopped to ask God what God knows about us that we might not know? Notice in this text earlier that Nehemiah prays to God before he asks the king for what he needs, because he knows that God can work in the king's heart. And we should pray for God to work in the hearts of the people that we rely on. But we should also pray and open our hearts to allow God to work within us. And after he has seen how things really are, he begins the physical process of rebuilding, in part by recruiting help. Verse 16 of Nehemiah chapter 2, the officials didn't know where I had gone or what I was doing. I hadn't yet told the Jews, the priests and the officials, the officers and the rest who were there, who were to do the work. So I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in. Jerusalem is in ruins and its gates are destroyed by fire. Come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we won't continue to be in disgrace. I told them that my God had taken care of me and also told them what the king had said to me. Let's start rebuilding, they said, and they eagerly began the work. When Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, and Geshem made fun of us, what are you doing? They asked, are you rebelling against the king? The God of heaven will give us success, I replied. As God's servants, we will start building. But you will have no share, right, or claim in Jerusalem. The God of heaven will give us success. As God's servant, we will start building. Today we've looked at two stories of rebuilding. We've looked at the story of Joshua leading his people into a new land, into a new life, into a rebuilt community, following God, going into unknown spaces. We've read the story of Nehemiah returning to a familiar space and beginning to rebuild. We've heard God's call. Be brave. Be strong. But we must not forget the words that follow. Chapter 1 of Joshua, verse 9. I've commanded you to be brave and strong, haven't I? Don't be alarmed or terrified, because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God gives us the strength to rebuild, to renew, and to restore. Amen.